What happened at Sinai? Okay, that's a good question. So, Ethel, please begin.
Good morning.
Good morning.
What happened at Sinai? Relating to God on his terms. In our prayers, we describe Shavuos as the season of the giving of our Torah. Our sages teach, however, that Abraham fulfilled the entire Torah before it was given, that he communicated it to his descendants, and that even throughout their servitude in Egypt, the Jews studied the Torah. If so, what is meant by the giving of the Torah?
So it's a very simple question. There's nothing new. Not only was there nothing new, they actually were observing it. Avraham was observing, fulfilled the entire Torah before it was given, including rabbinic law, our sages say. Even the 8 of Tafshilin, we're not explaining that now, but even that, even in Egypt, not everybody, but the tribe of Levi was studying Torah. So what's the whole drama? The whole drama and revelation of God at Mount Sinai, old news. Continue, please. Thank you.
This question can be resolved by reference to our sage's statement that a person who observes a mitzvah because he is commanded to do so is greater than one who observes it without having been so commanded.
So that's the answer that is given. Namely, the difference is, till now, it was observed voluntarily, with the exception of 1 or 2 mitzvahs like circumcision. All the other mitzvahs that Avraham observed and the Jews before the giving of the Torah studied and learned was all voluntary. Now it becomes a commandment. God commands it at Mount Sinai. Now you just read the quote that a person observes the mitzvah because he's commanded to do is greater than the one who observes it without having been so commanded. You would think the reverse is true. Wouldn't we think that on the contrary? If someone is obligated, but to do so voluntarily, through one's own volition, surely that is greater. So what do our sages mean? He's now going to explain.
Intellect is the most refined of our potentials, and yet the finite mind of mortal man cannot leap across the chasm to God's infinity, for no thought can grasp him at all. There need not be, however, a separation between them. By giving man the Torah and its mitzvahs, God has built a bridge that enables man to establish a bond with his maker on his terms.
So what he's saying, in other words, is that before the Torah was given, since it was done, observed voluntarily, so what did that make them? It didn't connect them to God, because it connected them to spirituality, no doubt, and perhaps even to defined and limited expressions of the divine, but not God himself, because God, unknowable and beyond even infinite, is fundamentally inaccessible. So all of the studying and meditation or rituals that we would observe because we have undertaken it voluntarily, in other words, we're not told to, it's not a commandment coming from God. Let me explain that a little clearer. How did the sages, not the sages, but the forefathers, how did they even know of these commandments and study Torah? Shem and Aver, the son and great-grandson of Noah, established the yeshiva. So what is this knowledge? What are they learning? What are they doing? So aside from simply, on a simpler level, not that it's simple, but they were developing the monotheistic ideas discovered by Abraham, meditating upon them and applying them to life. In addition to that, essentially what happened is, these are people of the spirit, prophets. However, the nature of their prophecy was the level of the divine that they ascertained through their effort. In other words, they climbed the ladder of divinity and discovered divine truths in heaven. Friends, there's an academy in heaven. There's yeshiva in heaven, where Torah is studied, and that's what they had accessed. What is missing? Well, let's convey it this way. In a famous story in the Talmud tractate Bava Metzia, when there was a conflict between the heavenly academy and the earthly academy, the sages down here, the end was that the sages prevailed and overrode the ruling of heaven. And God said, aha, God smiled and said, you've really touched me. In other words, the essence of God himself is beyond the heavenly academy, beyond heaven, beyond all description about how sublime, beyond all experience. The very essence of God is fundamentally inaccessible. How does one connect to God himself? The answer is we cannot, unless he allows it. How does he allow it and make it possible? By commanding us. By commanding us to learn this or do that. It's not the act or the concept that connects us. It's the fact that he commanded it. God says, I've invested my essence in my commandments. Observe Shabbos, learn Torah, you connect to me. Not because not working on the seventh day on a Saturday and in any way has anything to do with God himself. It has everything because he commanded it. So as I've expressed in the past, the people that say, Rabbi, I want to be spiritual, etc., why can't I define my own spiritual path? Why must I follow specific commandments? The answer is, as you just heard, you can define your own spiritual path and you'll be spiritual and you'll ascend the heavens. But to God, no connection. Because at the end of the day, it's all descriptive and finite. Physically descriptive, spiritually descriptive, heaven, angels, it's all finite. It's all creations, physical creations, spiritual creations. So you can be spiritual without God, but you can't be godly without God. And God is the truth, the essential truth. And one cannot access that essential, beyond all experience truth unless God allows it and commands it. And that's what Torah mitzvahs is all about. That's what we just said in that paragraph. So continue. The word mitzvah.
Word mitzvah and the word tzavta, meaning together, share the same root. When a person fulfills a divine command because he has been commanded to do so, the act which he performs is godly and connects him to God in all his infinity. If he performs the same deed without having been commanded to do so, his act, however worthy, remains merely a good deed. It does not establish a connection to the same nature.
So in other words, we can have morality without Judaism and ethics and all kinds of wonderful virtues, and they are wonderful. They're not godly. They are finite. And at the end of the day, in the face of the infinite God, they are meaningless, as is everything. Less than a speck of sand in the cosmos. Everything. Relative to a speck of the sand, the entire cosmos, which is virtually insignificant, we are immeasurably more insignificant in the face of the true infinite God. So we can come up with all kinds of wonderful virtues and morality. So what? Truth, God. How do we connect to God? The answer is, if he allows it and commands it. Now, by his divine choice, to be sure, his commandments become enclosed in morality. That's the packaging. All of the logic and reasons and spirituality, it's a very elaborate packaging. Tzedakah, Shabbos, Mikveh, Shavuos, Pesach, Tefillin, and so on. But the essence of it, it's utterly divine, godly, beyond all description, beyond heaven and beyond earth. And as we have pointed out in the past, this model applies to all relationships. If you want a true relationship with somebody else, it's on their terms, not yours. If you're going to define how to love, you're left with you. You love them the way they wanted to be loved. And that's the way it works in human relationships, how much more so with God. To connect to him is only on his terms. I don't know, how do you connect to God? He says, put on tefillin, give tzedakah, keep Shabbos, keep kosher. They're just physical acts. So how they connect me to God? Because he commanded. That's why. So in the famous words of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, the author of the Tanya, he says that if God would command us to chop wood every day, then that would connect us to him, just like Yom Kippur or any other mitzvah, lofty. The most lofty of mitzvahs, because it's not the act per se, it's that you commanded it. So whatever he commands, that would be the connection. He commands tefillin, Shabbos. But again, these commandments are packaged with all kinds of wonderful philosophy, which is finite and limited, but that's the packaging. The essence of it is utterly beyond all rational understanding, beyond heaven and beyond earth and beyond any heavenly creature, no matter how sublime. Therefore, continue. Please, Ethel.
Yes. Before the Torah was given, the patriarchs were able to perceive its spiritual truths through prophetic vision. Realizing the inherent value of a life governed by these truths, they structured their lives accordingly and observed even the minutest details of Torah law.
So to make it clear, because it's not clear here, so I'm going to spell it out. It's the packaging they accessed. The packaging. But not the essence, because God can't be accessed, no matter what steps you take. He's beyond the beyond. However, let's see.
However, since the Torah had not yet been given by God, and they had not been commanded to accept it, their observance did not lead to the same spiritual bond which is effected by the Jews' observance of the commandments after the giving of the Torah.
Yeah, it's not the same. It's more than spiritual. Actually, it's more than spiritual. The forefathers were spiritual. Once the Torah is given, it's not about being spiritual, it's about being godly. God is beyond spirituality and physicality equally. Heaven and earth in the face of God are the same. So they ascended on high. The packaging, the philosophy, the spirituality of Yiddishkeit, of Judaism, is what they observed. Radically different, however, is the moment the Torah was given, where doing that same commandment is not just spiritual, not just moral, and not just beautiful, not just ethical, and all of the libraries of books of explanations. It is now godly, that act. And you are forging a connection to God himself. That's immeasurably beyond mitzvahs before the Torah was given. And that's the meaning of our sages. Greater is the one who's commanded and the one who's not commanded. Because if you're not commanded, you'll access whatever you can access. The spiritual, the moral, it's all nice. But if you're not commanded, God's not invested in it and making that bridge, that impossible bridge, gulf between God and man to be bridged, then you can't do it. We're always forever bound up with who we are. Bigger, more spiritual, but still limited. 1 and a billion in the face of infinite are both equally insignificant. A billion is not closer to infinite. Not an iota. That's the point we're saying here. Okay, thank you. Well read. Actually, we're going to have a lot of readers today, so why don't you read a little bit further, please, Ethel? Lasting results.
Not only in the spiritual realms, but in the material world too. A deed performed as a mitzvah and a deed performed without the obligation of a mitzvah produce different effects.
Right. One is symbolic and the other is divine, godly. Let's continue. For example,
the Zohar states that when Yaakov laid out the staves of poplar, almond, and chestnut trees before Lavan's flocks, his actions evoked the same spiritual energies as are drawn down to this world through our performance of the mitzvah of tefillin.
He was peeling the bark, so the peeling of the bark evokes the straps of the tefillin. So what he was connecting to, which dimension of tefillin? The spiritual dimension, the apprehensible, they can grasp, apprehend dimension. That he did, the moral, spiritual, all of those things he got. But the sticks were just sticks, they're just symbolic. How does a stick become godly? Not just symbolically valuable. And all of the faith's friends, their rituals are symbolic. They represent. It's not in Judaism. Tefillin is holy. Mezuzah is holy. The day of Shabbos is holy. The physical day is holy. Yeah, how do you get spirituality into physicality? You cannot. Godliness you can, because God has no limits. And God's presence can be expressed even in the finite physical object. So our mitzvahs are radically different. The physical world is not a symbol for us. It actually becomes when you make a pair of tefillin and put them on a mezuzah on your door or observe the Shabbos, that day is holy. It's godly. Not symbolically, truly. How does this happen? How can a physical object become godly? Can't even become spiritual. That's the whole point, that God is beyond all limits of even physical and spiritual. Continue.
After the spiritual service associated with these staves was completed, however, they remained ordinary pieces of wood.
To begin with, they were just symbolic. The physical can't become spiritual. It can't. Continue.
The spiritual influences they evoked left no lasting effects upon them. In contrast, when a Jew puts on tefillin, the tefillin become sacred objects. Their holiness affects their very physical being.
Why? Because God commanded it, and in his commandment, he invests himself, and the impossible becomes possible. The physical object becomes sacred.
What is the reason for this difference? Since Yaakov's deed was not an obligatory mitzvah, it lacked the infinite power that flows from God's essence. For this reason, the influence of his actions remained on the spiritual plane and did not affect the physical nature of the staves. The mitzvahs we perform, by contrast, connect us to God in an infinite bond. They are therefore able to infuse spirituality even into the material substance of this world.
Impossible fusion is possible in the face of God himself. In their own worlds, they're incompatible. Spiritual and physical cannot be combined. You can't get spirituality into a cup. Here, bottle, take it. But the fusion does happen. Godliness. How? Because he commanded. And there are no limits to God, because he's the equal source of both physical and spiritual. Continue, final paragraph of the section. Thank you, Ethel.
This difference is reflected in our sage's midrashic comment. All the mitzvahs which the patriarchs fulfilled before you were vaporous.
Vaporous, which means an odor, lacked substance.
Whereas to us may be applied the phrase, your name is like flowing oil.
Oh, so this is the oil versus vapor. Vapor has no substance, oil is a substance. So the mitzvahs which the forefathers did were symbolic, it was spiritual. Us, it's tangible and real, the physical, like oil you can touch and flows down. The physical objects become sacred. Tefillin is holy. A physical body that undergoes a circumcision to get sanctified. A woman immerses in the mikveh is sanctified, not symbolically, godly. Okay. The mitzvahs
fulfilled by the patriarchs were ethereal, whereas the mitzvahs we fulfill manifest a tangible outpouring of the divine presence into our material world.
Okay, good. Let's go a little bit further. Okay, Ricky, please.
Yep, 1 second. Could you tell me exactly where we are?
Joining the physical and the spiritual.
Yeah. The above contrast is mirrored in another teaching of the Midrash. David said, "The Holy One, blessed be he, decreed, the heavens are the heavens of God, and the earth he gave to men."
Stop. So God decreed, the natural decree is that heaven is heaven and earth is earth. Spiritual is spiritual, physical is physical, never the twain shall meet. Again, infinite, finite are incompatible. Spirit and matter. You can't fit spirit into matter. Nevertheless, that's the natural order. Nevertheless,
when he desired to give the Torah, he nullified that original decree and said, "The lower realms shall ascend to the higher realms, and the higher realms shall descend to the lower, and I shall take the initiative. As it is written, and God descended on Mount Sinai, and to Moshe he said, ascend to God."
He's alluding here, he may explain it later. This is a very deep concept of the fusion in two directions. Heaven coming down and the earth being elevated. In other words, I'm not sure if he's going to elaborate on that. Maybe he will. Keep on going. In other words,
according to the original pattern of creation, the material and the spiritual were confined to separate realms of existence, to discrete planes that never converge. The ultimate divine intent, however, was to fuse the two so that the underlying godliness would surface within our material world. Because God's essence is truly unlimited, this is possible. The spiritual can descend and become manifest within our world, and our worldly experience can be elevated beyond material concerns and become an expression of spiritual truth.
all right, good. If you don't mind continuing, no longer in the heavens.
No longer in the heavens. This fusion cannot be accomplished through human enterprise alone. It is possible only because, as God says, I shall take the initiative. This is what is unique about the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. The divine revelations before Sinai had not been intended to resolve the fundamental conflict between the spiritual and the material. The revelation at Sinai, by contrast, was intended to permeate the totality of existence.
In other words, there was divine revelation before, but that was transcendent. That's why the forefathers chose to be shepherds, because all their spiritual experiences were otherworldly. It could not transform and become one with the physical. So they chose to be shepherds, allowing time for meditation and so on, not being engaged and distracted and preoccupied with the hustle bustle of the city and making life and commerce. So heaven remains heaven, earth is earth, and they ascended to heaven. But now heaven descends. That's because beyond heaven, God is causing the fusion. And that's what happened at Sinai, and therefore, and thus it, and this it did. This it did.
And this it did. No bird chirped, no fowl took flight. The entire natural order came to a standstill. Moreover, his voice did not have an echo. Instead of rebounding, God's voice permeated the material substance of the world. From that moment onward, the Torah is not in the heavens, but rather part and parcel of the environment in which we live.
Okay, good. So the significance, the Torah says that Koel Godlo is a big voice for Yosef and did not end. There are many meanings to that statement, the voice that God employed in saying the Ten Commandments. One of the meanings of it had no end, it didn't have an echo. And the question is, what's the significance of that? Echo, yeah, echo, no echo. What's the point? It's a very deep point. An echo means that the sound waves bounce off and not absorbed. God's voice has no echo means that for the first time in history, godliness permeates the physical because his essence has been revealed. Good morning. All right. Okay, let's conclude. Thank you, Ricky. Jacob, please. So that the world itself should see.
Not sure you can hear me. You can?
Yes, we can.
Good. So that the world itself should see. This was, however, merely the beginning of a process. The ultimate purpose of eliminating the gap between spiritual and material existence was the second phase. And Moishe ascended to God. In other words, that man should elevate himself and the material environment in which he lives.
In other words,
the reason for my stuttering is because I'm on the phone. I'm trying to do it this way. Okay.
Okay. In other words, there's two stages. At Sinai, God's invested in the world. You can access me through these commandments. That's God descending, quote unquote. Moishe ascending is now begin the process of sanctifying the world, mitzvah by mitzvah, symbolized by Moishe ascending, elevate the world, take the world, do mitzvahs with it. When it's completed, Messianic era dawns and God's presence revealed on earth. It's two movements, the empowerment and then the actualization, the realization. Continue.
As long as the connection between man, the world, and God is dependent on God alone, the fusion between these elements is incomplete. If godliness permeates the world only as a result of a revelation from above, the world remains, at least from its own earthbound perspective, separate from God. This may be understood by comparing the world to a student who is able to arrive at a concept only when nurtured by his teacher's explanations. Only when he has reached the point at which he can conceive of the idea on his own can we say that his thought processes have fully matured.
Okay, continue.
The service of God is epitomized in the phrase. And Moishe ascended to God, demonstrates just such a process of maturation within man and within the world at large. Man's divine service refines the world and transforms it into a vessel for godliness, enabling the world and its inhabitants to perceive godliness not as an externally supplied factor, but rather as the truth of its own existence.
Okay, conclude, please.
The consummation of our efforts to refine the world will come in the area of the redemption, when we will merit the fulfillment of the prophecy, and all flesh will together see that the mouth of God has spoken. Not that the revelation from above will be so intense as to reach down to our material realm, but that material flesh will have an independent appreciation of godliness. That era is fast approaching. All the spiritual tasks God has demanded of the Jewish people have been completed. All that is necessary now is for each of us to open his eyes, and then we will behold the ultimate purpose of the giving of the Torah, and manifestation of God's presence throughout the world. May this take place speedily in our days.
Amen. Thank you all for
Amen.
joining. A wonderful week.
Shavuot Tov.
Thank you very much. Shavuot
Thank
Tov.
you. Happy Yom Yerushalayim.
Oh,
Happy Yom
Yerushalayim.
Yerushalayim.
Yeah.
Shavuot
Shavuot
Tov.
Tov.
Shavuot Tov.